Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Jillian Dunks, and I am an archivist in McMaster Library's Department of Archives and Research Collections, and today I will be moderating this session. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to The Earthly Paradise, Recent Botanical Acquisitions at McMaster University Library, a presentation by Myron Groover. Before this presentation begins, I want to acknowledge the original and current inhabitants of this land, the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee nations, on whose territories I, as a Hamilton resident and McMaster employee, live. This land is protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. That's an agreement between Haudenosaunee, Ojibwe, and allied nations. This territory is also covered by the Between the Lakes Treaty No. 3 of 1792, which is a treaty between the Anishinaabe-Moan-speaking Mississauga people and the Crown. So today our discussion focuses on rare books which address ecological stewardship, among many other things. Before we dive in, I want to honor and acknowledge the ongoing work of Haudenosaunee and Mississauga nations who care for the land. Leanne Simpson, who is a Mississauga scholar, writes that part of what the Dish with One Spoon Treaty recognizes is a shared responsibility between Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations to take care of the territory, following each nation's culturally based environmental ethics. Simpson writes that Anishinaabe environmental ethics dictated that individuals should only take as much as they need. They must share everything, following Anishinaabe redistribution of wealth customs, and no part of an animal can be wasted. Decisions further about the use of resources were made for the long term with an eye to impacts on plant and animal nations, and also the next 7 generations of Anishinaabe people. This is a perspective that we urgently need to be reminded of in our era of rapid climate change and environmental degradation. I encourage everyone to reflect on some of the principles of the Dish with One Spoon Agreement as we listen today. And my colleague Bridget Whittle will share a link in the chat to the article that I've quoted from. So today you're joining us for a partnership event between McMaster alumni and the Department of Archives and Research Collections. This event is part of our Archives Alive series, which introduces members of the public to the unique holdings of the department. A reminder for today, this talk will be recorded. As you've seen in the video, please submit any questions you may have in the Q&A area, and we'll try to respond to these at the end of the presentation. And again, my colleague Bridget is monitoring the Zoom chat. Lastly, it is my great pleasure to introduce Myron Groover, our speaker for today. Myron is McMaster University's Archives and Rare Books librarian. He read history at the University of Aberdeen and library archival studies at the University of British Columbia. His work focuses on collection development, curation, and teaching with archives and rare books. His academic interests include book history, the material culture of text, and the history of ideas. Myron, welcome. I'm so looking forward to your talk.
Thank you so much, Jillian, and thanks to all of you for making the time to be here with us today virtually. I'm really excited about this talk in particular, a subject matter that is especially near and dear to my heart. So I'm just going to share my slides and get started because in typical Myronian fashion, I have way more ground to cover than I could possibly hope to do. So we're going to run through really quickly. So the title of today's talk is The Earthly Paradise, and hold on to that thought because we're going to come back to that motif later on. But the conceit, if you will, of this particular talk is to look at some recent acquisitions. So these are things that have either been donated or purchased within the last 5-6 years, relating to the theme of botany, horticulture, sylviculture, the growing of plants and trees, and their applications in human life and society during the early modern period. And I'm really excited about this because it's a chance to talk about new acquisitions, so things that very few people have had an opportunity to work with in our reading rooms so far. Here is a very zoomed out view of the text we're going to look at. You can see we have a daunting list of 10 things to get through, so we won't be spending too terribly long on any one item. The goal here today is to give a little bit of a flavor of the aesthetics of the period, to give some insight into the ways that people were working with these topics, and with one another or against one another in examining them, to look at some of the aesthetic qualities and artifactual qualities of the books themselves, and then to hopefully leave a little bit of time for questions at the end. For scale today, I am using a megalodon tooth, which was gifted to me by an acquaintance in the book trade a few years ago. I acquired a set of Ulisse Aldrovandi's Natural History, which we will see an example from today. And one of its pages is a to-scale illustration of megalodon teeth. And so someone gifted me a megalodon tooth so that I could usefully demonstrate the illustration was to scale. I'll be using it for scale today. It's about 5 inches tall by, let's say, 3 inches wide or so. Closer detail on the megalodon tooth, just because I really wanted to focus on how cool that is. We're going to start with the earliest, the oldest, I guess, of the books that we'll discuss today, which is Theodor Dorsten's Botanicon. Botanicon is the Latin title here, and we'll start here with some views of the exterior of the item and the title page. And I wanted to include here a photo of the spine, which shows this lovely kind of Gothic black letter handwritten title here, which is letting you know that this is about botanical medicine. It's from 1540, which, you know, for whoever's library this was the salient information that helped them to organize their shelves. So we don't see an author or necessarily a full title. What we're looking at here is a past user's practice for organizing their library. On the left, what we see is that one of the 2 variants of the title page of this volume. The other variant shows the printer's device. This one focuses fittingly on the content, which are plant illustrations. So it looks like we're looking at oregano and a couple of other things, maybe garlic, and I don't know what that is on the right. We'll start with a few fact morsels about this. This is the oldest of the books we'll be discussing today, and Theodor Dorsten was actually commissioned to do this work. A theme that we'll come back to several times today is that there are often kind of unclear boundaries between authorship, transcription, translation, editing in the early modern period. This work is no exception. So Theodor Dorsten, who was a fairly well-known botanist, was commissioned by the great publisher Christian Egenolf, who was publishing this volume. The idea being to to refine and translate from German a book by Eucharius Röslin called the Kräuterbuch, which just means the herb book, which was originally published in the 1530s. So the idea was to refine this, expand it, and translate it into Latin, the language of global scholarly exchange and intellectual culture in Northwestern Europe, so that it could reach bigger audiences with a more authoritative footprint. And it's kind of gone down in history as one of the first really accurately illustrated botanical texts. You can really clearly relate the illustrations in this text to the real world descendants of these plants today. It follows the tradition of a lot of German herbals in that it describes both plants and plant-derived substances. And fittingly enough, this book actually provided the nucleus or the seed matter for the latest book that we'll look at the very end of this talk, which is a late edition of Adam Lonitza's Kräuterbuch. In true early modern style, this book has not 1 but 3 indices in Latin, Greek, and the vernacular German, which I think is kind of charming. The German is typeset in sort of a Gothic blackletter Fraktur type, whereas the Greek is typeset fittingly enough in Greek, and Latin type is set fittingly enough in Roman type. So we have 3 different indices for navigating the book based on your own vernacular familiarity with the content. And I really wanted to zoom right in and look at some of the amazing illustrations. And these are all woodcuts here. So these aren't copperplate engravings. These are actually done, these are relief engravings in wood. And what we're looking at here are illustrations for lettuce, which we probably all recognize, juniper, which we may or may not recognize. If we don't recognize the plant, we may recognize it as the flavoring in gin. We also have here a kind of a charming vial of tamarind, which is a souring agent, fittingly enough, Tamarind means the date of India. It's a kind of date-looking plant from the Indian subcontinent, which produces a wonderful sweet, sour flavor, here recorded as tamarindus. And then in the lower right-hand corner, I love this. We have a little illustration of a vinegar barrel. So vinegar being a plant-derived substance at some degree of remove. and also an ingredient that's very important in the compounding of medicines and a substance believed to have medical properties in its own right. We have here a little carafe of vinegar illustrated. The next book we're going to talk about is kind of a funny book, and this is Gerard's Herbal from 1633. What we're looking at here is the copperplate title page of this book, and it's significant not just because it's a nice example of 17th century copperplate engraving. This was kind of a maximally exuberant phase in book art and ornamentation, and you have these sort of super overwrought, wonderfully busy and detailed copperplate title pages on a lot of volumes from the time period. The reason I'm sharing this one is not as an exemplar of the genre, but because it is arguably one of the only original works of intellectual derivation in this entire volume. This title page was done for this volume. The volume itself is heavily to completely plagiarized from other sources. So it's a plagiarism of a translation, which is itself a translation. So this book was originally written in Flemish by Reinbert Doldwin, and Doldwin translated it to Latin a few years later, again, to make a bigger splash in an international market. Gerard profits on the other end of that equation by translating it back from Latin into another vernacular, in this case, English. And there seems to be some evidence that he didn't even do all of the translating himself. It's possible that someone else was actually commissioned to work on this project before him, who conveniently died halfway through, enabling Gerard to allegedly use some of his translated material in the final volume. As a Baldrickian cunning plan, he figured if he reused the Flemish guy's plates, it would be just a little too obvious. So he rented other plates illustrating the same plants from another engraver / publisher on the continent to try and do. So he's putting in a bit of effort to obscure the intellectual origins of the work. What we're looking at here is the 1633 edition, which was greatly revised and expanded by more knowledgeable people. Gerard himself was not that educated when it came to botany. He made a lot of poor translations. He said a lot of things in the first edition that were just outright wrong. But because he put in so much work on it, it was like, well, maybe we can do something with this work. So a 1633 edition came out incorporating some of those expansions and corrections. And I love here, I just saw this for the first time yesterday. We have a description here of what's described as Turkey wheat, but that would be recognizable to any of us as zea mais in binomial nomenclature, or of course, corn. So already by the 1590s or early 1600s, there are numerous varietals of corn that are known within a kind of European botanical imaginarium. And here we have some of this wonderful descriptive language. The stalk of Turkey wheat is like that of the reed, full of spongy pith, set with many joints 5 or 6 foot high, big beneath and now and then of a purple color, and by a little small above. The leaves are broad, long, set with veins like those of the reed. So we get this kind of descriptive language that tells us, even in our modern vernacular, we can kind of clearly picture a tall stalk of corn when this is being described to us. Corn, by the way, one of the most miraculous examples of human geoengineering of a crop. The teosint, which is the origin kind of progenitor of our modern zea mais, is a tiny, tiny piece of grass. So the amount of selective breeding that had to be done to get these giant, delicious edible cultivars undertaken entirely by indigenous breeders in the Americas is just an astonishing and still quite poorly understood feat of geoengineering. Keeping with the vein of New World plants, here we have some beautiful woodcut illustrations of what they refer to as guinea peppers that we would recognize as hot chili peppers. Remember when I said we would come back to the theme of the earthly paradise or the botanical paradise? This is where we do so. What we're looking at here is a first edition of John Parkinson's Paradisi in sole paradisos terrestris, which means, it's like the earthly park of, okay, I'm giving it away. The thing I love most about this book is that the entire title is an elaborate multi-language pun on the author's own name. So rad. So the author's name is Parkinson, and he calls the book in Latin, The Earthly Park of the Park in the Sun. meaning himself, which I just love, and it's still making me laugh hundreds of years later. So thanks for that, bro. This is a kind of a cool book in a number of regards. First, it's focused very heavily on practical gardening, which is very near and dear to my heart. I come from a long line of gardeners, of whom I am the least hardworking and least proficient. But gardening is something that I really, really value. And we recognize in this work a gardener at work, so a gardener as an author. He was also a royal apothecary to James I, the famously laid back and sanguine individual. So his life was definitely not stressful at all. And this was actually originally intended to be a more comprehensive book. He wanted to write a book giving all uses of all plants throughout all time. And when he got to the end of the second chapter, he realized that the chapter he intended to write on medicinal plants was going to be like 10 or 15 times longer than all of the rest of the material combined. So he decided to spin out these sections on ornamental and kitchen gardening and publish them as their own work and revisit the medical subject later on, which we'll get to in a minute. As I mentioned, he has a special focus on gardening, especially home gardening. And it starts with this, we actually have the first and second edition. So what we're looking at are selections from title pages of both of the first two editions of this book. And in the middle of the motif, you can see this kind of Adam and Eve knife figures here, still in the Garden of Eden. And if you look above the tree that Adam is holding onto, you'll see this very bizarre sheep-like creature. This was a kind of allegorical plant called a vegetable lamb of Tartary, which is supposed to grow in the regions of what we would now think of as Crimea, Eastern Ukraine kind of area. I encourage you to look it up. It's a completely wild story. There's some attempt now to kind of retcon the vegetable lamb and be like, oh, they were describing cotton, they just didn't know it. I don't know if I buy that, but it's one of these kind of wonderful motifs that crops up in early modern botanical art. And we see here the standard of illustration. Again, these are all woodcut engravings, but just extraordinarily detailed. I mean, look at these irises on the right. These would be recognizable to any of us as something that grows in our own gardens and will indeed here in Ontario be blooming within the next month or so, which is quite exciting. On the left, we see some examples of kind of parterre or garden bed design, which is cool. Remember, this volume really focuses a lot on practical gardening. So the first section is the Garden of Pleasant Flowers, which deals with the florist's art and the art of cultivating ornamental flowers. The second part, which is near and dear to my heart as a cook as well as a gardener, deals with kitchen plants and things that you cultivate to eat in your own home garden. And he drills down and takes almost kind of an ethnographic approach with some of these descriptions. So what he's got here is he's talking about the different culinary uses of beets. He says the Italian beet, and so likewise the last red beet with great ribs are boiled, and the ribs eaten in salads with oil, vinegar, and pepper, and is accounted a rare kind of salad and very delicate. What he's pointing to here is essentially chard, what we would call red chard or Swiss chard. And if you've ever eaten chard, you know you can use the stem and the leaf as two different kinds of vegetables. Here he's pointing to a use for chard stem in particular. Chard, of course, being a cultivar of beet that's grown for its leaf rather than its root. So he walks through different kind of culinary applications of a very common and well-known plant in a way that I think is just very, very charming. Now we're going to kind of close the circle of Parkinson's career. This is the Theatrum Botanicum. We're not going to look at the inside of this today, although we'll talk about it a little bit. What I wanted to show here is an example of the wonderful work that my colleagues in our conservation lab do. So I have a colleague named Bronwyn who's in our conservation lab working on this volume, possibly even as we speak. This was something we purchased a few years ago. It's a very, very significant item, but it arrived in quite a delicate state. There was a lot of damage and wear to its spine and hinges in particular, such that we didn't feel super comfortable having users work with the item in the state that it came to us in. So we started thinking about what we could do to extend the useful life of this book while preserving as much of the binding that has come to us as possible. So what we're looking at here are some action shots of really getting a view into looking at the structure of the spine and the sewing of this book. And then on the right, you see some of the reinforcements that my colleagues starting to put onto the bands with a view to really reinforcing this whole thing. And she told me that some of these bands are actually partly made out of alum tawed pigskin, which is one of the most durable materials. And they are holding up far better than the bands that were made with other types of leather and hide. This was the pinnacle of his medical work. This attempted to really give a very, very comprehensive look at all sorts of different medical plants. It remained a standard illustrated reference for over a century after being published, and it provides information on a really wide range. Remember the Botanicon of Dorsten was looking at things like, you know, bitumen and vinegar. This one zooms out even further and looks at things like mummies, for which there was a brisk trade at the time, saying, oh, these are the best kinds of mummies to consume to remedy human ailments. And this book also had quite a few botanical specimens and scraps between the pages, which our conservators have lovingly placed in their own enclosures and identified where they came from, so we can keep that contextual material with the book. Now we'll move on and talk about another kind of interesting example of translation / editing / authorship / looking back to the classical milieu / looking to the present and future of expanding geographic horizons for European knowledge of the world. And this is a highly significant translation of a work originally in Greek by Theophrastus, who I think was one of Aristotle's students. Here given under its Latin title of Historia Plantarum. This is a 1644 translation, but it raises that question again: where does translation begin and end? The editorship that Bodeus von Stapel put into this volume at least matched the original scholarship that went into writing the original in the classical period. So not only does he translate it from Greek into Latin and ensure that both languages are typeset in parallel so that you can compare the source text with his translation, he's also adding a huge amount of commentary, and in many cases writing and illustrating entirely new sections of the work, which how can you do with a 2,000-year-old book, right? So he writes extensive new material based on what was then extremely recent research on plant life in Asia, in the Americas, in South Africa in particular, taking advantage of drawings and plates that were made on a voyage to South Africa by a European botanist just a few years before this was published. So is this really Theophrastus, or is this Theophrastus plus Bodeus von Stapel? I'm a little inclined toward the latter interpretation. But it's a kind of an interesting question to think about. And here we see an example of just this absolutely beautiful, astonishingly technically proficient typesetting here, Greek on the left, Latin text on the right. A really, really well done work here, aesthetically, as well as in terms of its information and scholarship. Again, really beautiful woodcut illustrations. On the left, we're looking at walnut. And the right, we're looking at coriander. Coriander being, of course, one of the easiest herbs to grow in a kitchen garden. I encourage you all to try it. And anyone who has recognized it, here you can see coriander when it's in that wonderful stage of just starting to go to seed, when the seeds are still green. And if you've never tried green coriander seeds, I highly recommend it, especially if you're making a Thai curry or anything. They're delicious. They have some of the flavor of the fresh plant and the flavor of the dried spice all together. Now we're going to move on and talk about one of my favorite works ever, probably of all time, as well as one of my favorite works in our collection, which is John Evelyn's Sylva, or A Discourse of Forest Trees. We're looking at here a copy from the first edition of 1664. This is something we acquired a few years ago. We have numerous later editions of this work, but we didn't have a first. And you can see there the arms of the Royal Society on the title page. This was indeed among the first publications of the Royal Society. And it has this fantastic backstory that's, you know, like many historical backstories, now kind of being interrogated to see how much of this is mythology, how much of it really happened, et cetera, et cetera. But it is clear, regardless of mythologization, there is some connection between the authorship of this book and a sort of national concern over the fate of Britain's timber stock in the 1600s. So remember, this is a time period when Britain's foreign policy is pretty heavily dependent on having a functional navy and having not only a functional navy, but a very, very strong navy. Well, ships are made of wood. And if you don't manage your stock of mature timber well, especially if you're a small island nation, you risk depleting permanently your timber stash and not being able to build masts, not being able to build ships anymore. So there's a kind of enabling myth here that Evelyn was asked to write a discourse on the propagation of timber, specifically to kind of save the country. That's part of it. There's aesthetics at play at well. There's an argument about, did this really have an impact on sylviculture that much? Maybe not. Maybe it didn't do what it was advertised to do. But it is still a real milestone in publishing. It's one of the first works of kind of practical dendrology and sylviculture, one of the first books of practical forest management, although it doesn't deal with forest management till the very, very end. What I love about it is that this reveals a real gardener's love for his subject matter. One of the companion works that comes with Sylva is at the end is included after this, loving meditation on trees and how they can be cultivated and what their personalities are and so on. He has a more prosaic calendarium hortense, which is like a farmer's almanac, showing the monthly operations that you should be doing in your garden at various times of year. And so here we see a list of tasks that need to be thought about in March, what things you should be planting, what you should be staking, what you should be grafting, what you should be doing to your soil. And you'll notice that March is actually kind of the nadir of the cook's year, right? This is as far from a fresh harvest as you get all year long. So he shows the fruits in prime are yet lasting as a very few varieties of long cellaring apples and pears. Whereas if you were to contrast that with, say, August, he gives an astonishingly long list of fruits that are currently ripe. So you really get a sense of seasonal ways of living and the kind of produce that was available to people at different times of year, and how important food storage was to be able to continue to have green stuff and fresh stuff in some understanding of the term fresh throughout the winter months. Another work here, again, from a much larger multi-volume set. This is confusingly, right? This is Ulisse Aldrovandi's, attributed to Aldrovandi anyway, book on dendrology. This is part of a 12-volume set on natural history that covers like an astonishing range of subject matter. Serpents, monsters, several books on birds, one on trees. So it's this huge set of books, one volume of which focuses on trees specifically. It's an interesting work because it was published many decades after Aldrovandi's death. I think he only ever saw the first 1 or 2 volumes complete during his lifetime. So his students and intellectual heirs continued working with his teaching collection to author subsequent volumes in the series. And indeed, what Aldrovandi was most famous for was the most sumptuous botanic garden and Wunderkammer, so specimen museum on the continent during his day. So this is an example of the illustration in this volume. One of the things that was significant about this volume in particular was it pulled together illustrations from all of the most reputable sources at that time. So the plates of people like Bellon and Gessner and these great kind of engravers of the 16th century, and put them all in one place, which made this a comprehensive illustrated reference work for well over 100 years after it was first published. What we're looking at on the left here, familiar to scholars of manuscripts well into the modern period, we're looking at a section on oak galls, which are a particular type of insect-induced canker that grows on oak trees. Those cankers are the baseline ingredient, or one of the baseline ingredients for iron gall ink, which was the predominant manuscript writing ink really well into the 19th century in some places. So what we're looking at here are the galls that give us the ink. This is a really sumptuously illustrated book. This is kind of a folio size. So the book's about the size of my torso. So these are woodcuts that are very, very substantial in nature. Here we're looking at some beautiful pear species. Interestingly, this book profiles also a lot of New World species, which I wasn't necessarily expecting when I was flipping through it. One of the interesting things that I want to highlight about this work is that Aldrovandi was one of the few authors we're looking at today who was working in not just a super Catholic jurisdiction, but one that had no insulation or very little insulation between the civic authorities and the church itself. So he is kind of active during the late 16th century, exactly during the Tridentine moments, the Council of Trent, the Counter-Reformation. It's during his life that the papacy starts getting serious about its index of banned books. We have at least one reputable report that Aldrovandi himself had books confiscated from him and possibly burned by the ecclesiastical authorities at some point. So it was tough and semi-illegal to keep a really current natural history library if you were active on the Italian peninsula at this time. So he's obliged to certain forms of kind of subterfuge and influence politics and other kinds of devious strategies to maintain the network of intellectual and scholarly communication that he depends on, not just for growing his collection, but for growing his knowledge about it. So it's kind of an interesting and idiosyncratic feature of his working life. It's hard for me to choose from these books. As you can probably tell, I'm very, very keen on the subject matter indeed. I would be hard pressed to pick a favorite, but if the chips were down, this might be my favorite of the lot. This is a 1684 edition of Castore Durante's Herbario Nuovo, like the new Herbal, right? Very imaginative title. This is a 1684 edition of a much earlier work, which shows you how long this was in print. It was actually originally printed in 1595. So now we have an edition being produced like a clean 100 years later. This is still au courant enough to be worth continuing to publish. I think it's one of the most technically proficient herbals or botanical books that I've ever seen in terms of its aesthetics. It really leads the reader through the text. The illustrations are phenomenal. Now, I've done more and more kind of digging on the history of the illustrations of this volume because there's an interesting conundrum at play here. There were two engravers with the last name of Parasole who were a married couple who were active at the same time in Italy. It seems fairly conclusive that only the husband worked on this volume, but I wanted to draw attention to this partnership, not only because you had a spousal pair of engravers, both working in the same milieu and same area, which is pretty unusual, but also the fact that Leonardo, who came from lowlier stock, actually took his spouse's name. So when he married Isabella, who was from a quite well-known armigerous Sicilian family, and he was like some nobody from the mainland, he took her name as a way of opening doors for his future career. It's written in beautiful, clear, concise language, and the detail of the woodcuts in this is just exceptional. These are so human. They give such a feeling of place and atmosphere. And what we're looking at, and I love this left illustration. This has to have been done on purpose. It's an aquatic plant called duckweed, with ducks here included for scale. In the middle, we see marjoram, and on the right, we see a camphor tree growing by a bay. And from the headgear of the people in the scene, we can infer that we're looking at the Eastern Mediterranean or the North African coast. So this book is just filled with these little details. And when I say that it's one of the most technically proficient, this spread gives an idea of the layout that we're talking about. All of the areas of page real estate are clearly delineated. The design of the entries is gorgeous and very, very intuitive. The standard of illustration is very, very high. It's alphabetically organized, so it's super easy to move through. What we're looking at here are different kinds of pepper. Long pepper, Ethiopian pepper, which is used in berbere, the wonderful spice mixture of East Africa and the Horn of Africa. We're also a little more familiar. Pepper, Bibericum negrum, the black pepper that we all eat, and chili peppers here. So it's just a gorgeous book, and it goes through the astrological significance of the plants, their medical uses, their culinary uses, anything cultural about them. And I just can't get enough of that. One of the last volumes that we'll look at here, and I'm just going to check how I'm doing for time because I tend to go badly over. Oh, good, I'm doing all right. One of the last we'll look at is another gorgeous and kind of beguiling and intriguing work of editing and translation. This one's a little bit more of a straight translation. This is a translation from a French, very well-known, he was a lawyer, but also a gardener by the name of Jean de La Quintigny. And he was someone who was active in the design of the palace gardens at Versailles during his lifetime. And here we have a wonderful, extensively bewigged portrait of Jean de La Quintigny here. Of all the books, when I was going through this one, this was the one that kept surprising me the most with its content. I extra love this edition because this translation into English was actually done by John Evelyn himself, who was like this kind of, multi-nerdular polymath who spoke 5 or 6 languages and was constantly writing and translating back and forth between Italian and French and Dutch and so forth. So this is him taking a work that he feels is so significant in the gardening milieu that it merits a translation into English for domestic audiences. De La Quintigny was, I find this completely hilarious. There's a whole garden at Versailles that's just called the potager, like the soup garden, which gives this kind of humble and groveling kind of vibe, it is a meager patch of earth which produces some small simples for His Majesty's table. No, the potager was like this enormous, super pretentious, reclaimed piece of land that used to be held to be too wet to grow anything on. And I love that this book actually has a very humble brag plan of the potager at Versailles as a copperplate fold out. The other thing I love about this book is that it's completely focused on gardening, right? It doesn't have pretensions to being a medical textbook. It's not trying to recount, as Aldrovandi in particular did, every classical reference to these plants that was ever done. That was one of the things about Aldrovandi's work that was so valuable, was he tried to pull together all of the learned ancients in addition to the modern illustrations in one place. In this case, the author's focus is completely on the practicalities of growing healthy, beautiful plants. And this is one of the details I noticed when I was going through this volume. I kind of take a little curator's flip through when I'm getting ready to give a talk like this and see what things jump out at me. If you will notice in the Latin text, toward the second paragraph break, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but let's say about a quarter of the way up the path, quarter way up the text, you'll see a reference, dum sub sole aleo loduicus ab hoste reportat. Okay, and in English, the translation is given as whilst they blank out the King of France's name to avoid offense to domestic audiences and to avoid burnishing the accomplishments of the Roi Soleil and his heirs. So they translate this entire ridiculous, pompous poem that someone has written in praise of Louis and his gardens. They translate the whole thing into English, but then every time Louis's name appears, it is blanked out as L-S, which is a kind of 18th century, 17th century conceit for anonymizing someone's name. I just got such a kick out of that. Sidebar, the name Ludwig actually comes down to us from a very old Germanic name. You might be thinking, well, Louis is such a French name. Well, it comes from a very old Germanic antecedent, Chlodeweg, who was like this Merovingian chieftain back in the day. And it's come down to us as Ludwig and Louis, depending on where in the Holy Roman Empire you were. Anyway, side tangent. All of the chapters have these gorgeous copperplate engravings. Here we have two gentlemen just casually holding up a crown folio-sized book saying maxims in terms of gardening, since that's obviously what you do in the garden, is show other people your large books on gardening. Whatever, it was the 17th century, it was a weird time. Again, the emphasis on practicalities in this volume is amazing. So we're looking at here at different patterns of branches, what you should be looking for healthy branch growth. On the right-hand side, what we're seeing is instructions for grafting, grafting better branches onto healthy rootstock, which is the way that you get apples and pears to produce true to variety. And on the left, we even have a super detailed look at some of the grim and gruesome cutting implements that were useful in gardening at the time. And some of you may have recognized the designs here are kind of astonishingly similar in some cases to French Opinel wood-handled gardener's knives, which are still beloved by many. My dad swears by them. So it's a kind of an interesting resonance between that time and this. And I could not resist a moment spent on this page, which because I have this sense of humor of a 2-year-old, I found very, very interesting and hilarious, which is a whole page on different kinds of dungs that you might want to use in the garden. And I love this line in particular. I cannot forbear saying that dung being a vulgar thing and so well known, it seems useless and almost ridiculous to endeavor to give an account on it. But yet, in order to continue to follow exactly the design I have proposed in this treatise, which is not to omit the least singularity of all that belongs to gardening, I think myself obliged to speak of this dung, not indeed to make it known to such as are unacquainted with it, since it would be hard to meet with such, but only to make some observations upon it, which are very material for the matter in hand. So I'll leave that all somber and intellectual remembrance with you. As we move on to our very last volume, which is a quite late edition of Adam Lonitz's Kräuterbuch. You remember the very first book we talked about, Dorsten's Botanicum. I said that it served as the nucleus of a later work. So whereas the Botanicum itself was a translation from German into Latin, one of the people who was hired to work on the Botanicum project and its subsequent editions eventually retranslated and expanded the work in German so much that he produced his own Kräuterbuch, which became a standard reference source in German vernacular for plant lore and science for a number of years, almost 100 years, in fact. So this is a 1713 edition of a book that was first published in maybe the 1560s. Again, a view of how long the impact of some of these books could be. And again, taking a very expansive view on what constitutes plant-related knowledge. We have lots of information on distillation and different chemical operations that are important to making second and third order uses of plant-derived materials. Again, beautiful illustrations. You can see that this format is clearly in conversation with Dorsten's Botanicum, the same kind of vibe here, although of course mostly now typeset in Fraktur for a German audience. So here, what are we looking at here on the right? Oranges, I guess. And it also has these beautiful vernacular illustrations of garden processes, which are really charming. This costumery would have been current when the engravings were first done. By 1713, this would have been like outrageously naif style, but they continue using the plates anyway, which I get such a kick out of. And lastly, I had to share this fantastically bizarre illustration, which is from a section pertaining to figs. And I'm like, okay, figs are a purgative, but I didn't know they were this much of a purgative. I don't exactly know what's going on here, but it really made me laugh. This guy is clearly having a very bad day as a result of something he's eaten. So don't get into whatever he's gotten into. And at that point, I'll leave it there in the hopes that we still have a little time for questions. Thanks for being with me for this whirlwind tour of just a few very recent acquisitions. And I'll answer a question that we always get asked first, which is yes, these are all available to access in our reading room, and we would love to have you come in and work with them. We'll also be looking at digitizing some of these as the future progresses. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Myron. I really enjoyed this. It's such a pleasure to see all of the beautiful illustrations and cheeky illustrations too. So we have a number of pre-submitted questions, and we've got a couple of good questions in the Q&A too, but we have about 15 minutes. So I'll start with a pre-submitted question. We had a lot of questions pre-submitted kind of in this grouping. Do we have any botanical books written by female authors?
That's a great question. And yes, we do. I don't know what we have from the kind of early modern period proper, but when we start getting into the long 18th century, we're going to see more in that vein in our collection. And I would draw your attention in particular to a very, very interesting work called Botanic Dialogues by an author named Maria Jackson, who wrote in the late 18th century, essentially a botanical textbook. And it takes the form of an imagined dialogue between Hortensia, so the personification of a garden, and her 4 children, who are named like Billy and Fanny and like super common 18th century names. So it's a weird juxtaposition. Like, oh yes, young Billy, that's an excellent question about, the propagation of peas. Like, no, Billy would never ask that. But anyway, the interesting thing about this book is that it's ostensibly a teaching book, right? It's for teaching young children the basics of selective breeding and how plants reproduce and whatnot. It's also very scientifically sophisticated, and it was something that put the author in a super difficult position. So the early editions of this book were published anonymously because it was seen as so inappropriate for women to be publicly discussing the very real biological and sexual implications of plants reproducing, that they could be really shut out of any discourse around botany. So Maria Jackson's Botanic Dialogues is certainly one to look at. There are others whose titles escape me at the moment, but that's one. And I'd like to give a shout out to Dr. Katie Sagal as well, who was one of our ASEX fellows a few years ago, who was doing work on that text and drew my attention to it. And she wrote a wonderful book. I want to say it came out possibly even this year or last year, called Botanical Entanglements. And if you're interested in women's contributions to botany in the long 18th century, early modern period, I highly recommend it. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Myron. I'm going to jump around a little bit. We have a couple of questions around how many copies of these books were released in a print run, and do people need to be very well off to own a copy?
Okay, that's a really good question. It's a double-barreled question too. Even in the books we've talked about today, we're covering almost, in fact, over 150 years of time. So the earliest thing we're talking about is from 1540, the latest from 1713. Material economies, wages, all of those things shifted a lot between those two endpoints. And if we think of the early modern, I mean, let's use a very brutish conception of the early modern period as starting in, whatever, 1453. We'll say fall of Constantinople, advent of the printing press. In Germany, you take that as a start date and take the end date, again, really crudely, as 1700. That's a really big span of time in which the underlying technology of printing remains pretty stable, but the economies that supported it and the kind of paraprofessions that supported it changed a lot during that time period. So the answer of whether, how costly a book is something that changes over time. But one constant of that entire time period is that, by and large, paper is the single biggest overhead that printers have. It's the most expensive thing they have on hand, and something they can't afford to waste. What that means is the bigger a book is, the more it costs, because the more paper it's using. And particularly something with, you saw that Aldrovandi natural history, the 2-page spread looking at the pear trees. That's like using a huge amount of paper to basically reproduce just 2 illustrations. So you're not making... my Teutonic mindset is like, oh, you're not making an efficient use of space. Well, it's a different use of space, but it does drive the cost up. The bigger the book and the less that's on it, the more it's going to cost. So some of the innovations in print technology were actually really around that idea of increasing affordability by decreasing the size of format and output. And some of those changes happened super rapidly too. Like by 1500 in Italy, the House of Albus had already figured out that making little paperback-sized octavos was a great way, that weren't illustrated, was a great way of selling more product to people who were in a hurry and who were on the go. The other end of that scale is like a giant folio or crown folio, heavily illustrated volume. Illustrations also drive up the cost. And then there's a further price point differential when you start incorporating copperplate illustrations, because copperplate illustrations have to be produced on a separate machine. They have to be produced on a completely different press than woodcut or typesetting. So there are these kind of inflection points that drive up cost. The cheapest books weren't exactly what you or I might think of as affordable, but they weren't astronomically expensive either. At the other end of the scale, though, Some of the really large, sumptuously illustrated, multi-volume, kind of like desk thumpers, yeah, they can be really, really, really expensive, particularly if they came in a set and you wanted to get them all in the same edition. And then you would usually have to bind them yourself. So there's kind of knock-on effects of cost. Print runs also a moving target depending on the location, the time period, et cetera, et cetera. But print runs are always a factor of the kind of nth dimensional chess that the printer is playing to try and figure out how many copies of something he can actually sell. It's not worth doing a print run if you're going to do less than a certain amount, but you have diminishing returns at a certain point too. So printers are trying to kind of dial in the sweet spot there, so they're not wasting paper and product. So that was like a non-answer to a very, very good question.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions here around digitization, so I'm going to try to kind of group them together. We have some questions about whether these texts are digitized, not just by our institution, but, maybe anywhere in the world. And also kind of as a counterpoint, a question about if there's something that we lose in accessing these texts in a digital, format as compared to in real life.
Really, really good questions, both. In answer to the first, many, if not all of these will be digitized, but remember that they went through like many, many editions. So, you might have earlier copies of Lonitz's Buch digitized. Is the 1713 one from Ulm digitized? I don't exactly know. Aldrovandi's Naturally History, a lot of it is digitized, but almost none of it is translated from Latin into English. And that's another thing, like, a huge amount of the scholarly output of the early modern period has never been translated into any contemporary vernacular. So if you don't have language, you can't engage with a lot of these texts at all. That's the reason that people, like Evelyn or Gerard could make a buck doing translations. There was a demand then as now. So yes, a lot of these will have been digitized in some edition by some library somewhere. The second point absolutely holds true, right? Digitization flattens and occludes a huge amount of the context of a book, not least, its crudest dimensions of materiality, its weight, its heft, the smell. I'm a book fancier, so I got to talk about book smell. Its format, the obvious use marks that previous owners have left on it, the fragility of its boards that are conveyed by repeated use, the substance of its end papers, book plates, pen trials. The title page of that Dorsten Botanicum we were looking at has a little pen trial where somebody is perfecting a flourish of their pen as they're writing. So yes, we do lose a lot in the process of digitization. The other thing is that digitization is not cost neutral. Digitizing material is expensive. Preserving digital material is astronomically more expensive than preserving physical material. So whenever something gets digitized, you're looking at the end of a really long chain of decisions, curatorial decisions. So we lose a lot in the digitization process, which is not to denigrate it. It's really, really important. And the pandemic has certainly showed us more than ever how important remote access is. But I try to be really careful in my own teaching and thinking to frame digitization as a process of generating facsimiles of real artifacts rather than creating a digital version, which may seem like an intellectual conceit, but I think it's an important one.
Thanks, Myron. We have a question today. It was pre-submitted. Today is April 20th, the famous 420 unofficial holiday. What do these volumes tell us about cannabis, if anything?
Just in case anyone asked about that, I wanted to have a slide ready. I don't know if you can see my share here. Yes, many of these books deal with cannabis. In fact, most of them do. It was a really well-known and widely used plant. Remember, like this was one of the most useful fiber crops in the world. This was used in cordage, in the manufacture of textiles, and one of the things I love about rare books and about teaching about rare books and books from the hand press period is getting people to think about a world, people by human beings who have bodies just like ours, who are very similar to us in many ways, but who are participating in a very, very, very different material economy than we can imagine in a kind of fossil fuel enabled era. So I talk about like, well, yeah, it was a big deal in the manufacture of cordage and textiles. Like, guess what? Those were foundational industries to everything that people did. If you didn't have rope and you didn't have clothes and you didn't have bags, you couldn't do anything. Leather making was another example of, like, leather was the plastic of the pre-modern world. So yes, hemp or cannabis sits at the bottom of a lot of chains of production, but it's also, its medical qualities are recorded in a lot of these texts. It's often ascribed anti-inflammatory properties in these texts. It's occasionally ascribed sedative properties. It's repeatedly referred to as an appetite stimulant, which may be familiar to some of us. So it was a known plant. It was a universally known plant, and it was a very highly praised plant. When people write about it, they might be inclined to say that it smells kind of bad, but they will also almost always have language about how noble and useful this plant is. And they're not referring here to its narcotic properties. They're referring to its absolutely vital use in the manufacture of cordage and textiles, which is something that we're just kind of coming back to now in a late capitalist realization that suddenly we urgently need biomass for doing things that we used to make out of plastic and fossil fuels. So yes, it's in most of the texts that we talked about today.
Thanks, Myron. I think we have time for one more question, and then I'll wrap up. But we've received a lot of questions about plant matter that's pressed into the pages of the volumes. And there's a specific question about the plant matter in Theatrum Botanicum. So I'm wondering if you could speak to that a bit. Is it common to find plant matter in these types of books?
Common is a sliding scale, and I'm only informed here by my own experience working with rare books, which is naturally limited. I would say that in my personal experience, it is not what I would call common to find specimens pressed in books of this nature. But as anything I say, I want to condition that with a few things. You might find one or two things pressed, particularly in like the end boards where pressing something isn't going to have an effect on the text. Generally speaking, though, I don't find a lot of material pressed in books like this. I think that's partly because previous owners may have thought of these as reference works. Like these are most of what we looked at today are quarto or folio sized volumes. So they're quite large. They're not very portable. They're not really designed, nor would it be possible to take them out and use them as like a field guide, which means that they're by and large being used in an inside environment. I also want to hark back to our conversation about kind of cost and the maximalism of producing these illustrated works. Like they cost a fair amount of money. You don't necessarily want to dork them up by putting specimens in them. Where you do see specimens is in their own specimen books. So keen naturalists will often keep a separate set of like basically blank folio or crown folio sized volumes or smaller. But the ones we have in our collection are folio sized, where you basically do a living Wunderkammer in the pages of the book. So you press things in kind of a systematic way and label them. So it's a specimen catalog, it's a book, it's a Wunderkammer all at the same time. That being said, and speaking specifically to the Theatrum Botanicum, our conservator did find lots and lots of little bits of vegetal matter in it as she was working with it, and has kept those in their own enclosures with a reference to where they were found. Because when we do find things like that, they're another way of measuring previous users' engagement with a book. So we don't want to lose that context if possible. Part of my whole philosophizing about what differentiates physical books from digital is exactly that with physical artifacts, we have more room to move with representing the plurality of their contexts and the ways that their readers engage with them. And I'm thinking in particular of a much later volume in our collection, which is a 20th century volume, actually, from the archival collection of Vera Brittain, where she has a practice of pressing a flower from whatever bouquet is on the family's dining table. Every time they get new flowers, and they're an English relatively well-to-do family, so they're keeping up appearances, and there are always flowers on the table. And whenever there are new flowers, she presses one, and she'll often record like a biographical detail next to the flower. And sometimes those are really prosaic and kind of quotidian details. And one day, must have started as a day like any other for her. She records next to a blue delphinium. It just stays with me. It's haunting. It just says Edward Catlin, MC, killed in action, Italy, whatever. It's her brother. And then it just says blue delphiniums on I get choked even talking about it. Blue delphiniums on the dining room table. So it's very prosaic kind of activity of chronicling flowers over time becomes a testament to, in this case, certainly one of the most, if not the most traumatic event in the life of the person preserving them. So yes, you do find specimens and things, but in my experience, the specimens tend to be the point rather than an incidental inclusion. Although it does happen. It's like we have, a thing from there was some Vimy Ridge pilgrimage that was organized at some point after the Great War. And someone who went on that pilgrimage pressed one of the poppies from the field in their like commemorative brochure. So you do find things like that sometimes, but I haven't run into it too often with the real big boy early modern tomes.
Thank you so much, Myron. This was such a wonderful and informative talk. We so appreciate your time. For everyone who has asked, this talk was recorded and a link will be available for viewing in about a week. The alumni office will send a link, and also the video will be available with captions on McMaster University's UTV YouTube channel. You will see a survey pop up when the webinar ends. The alumni team is very appreciative of your feedback, so please do fill this out. And once again, thank you so much to Myron, Bridget, Christine, and Dave, our alumni partners, and all of you for joining us today. Have a great afternoon. Take care.